All right, my name's Christopher Donald, and this is going to be a demonstration of basic glazing. So just to start off with, at Claymakers, all of our glazes, the vast majority of the glazes that students are going to use are water-based. That means that the way that they stick to the pots is through absorption. The pieces have already been fired once, which is the bisque firing, and the bisque firing makes it so that they're hardened, so they're more durable, so that you can move them around and manhandle them a bit without them breaking easily. But it makes it so that they're still a little bit porous. They're not fired to their full vitreous temperature. And being a little bit porous makes it so that they'll absorb some water from the glaze, and that makes the glaze stick to the outside. That depends on a lot of things, on what temperature it was bisque fired at, how thick the piece is, how quickly you dip it into the bucket and take it out again. So the easiest way of knowing whether or not you've got the correct glaze thickness is something called a scratch test, which I'm going to show as we get a little bit further into the process here. A couple things to keep in mind when you're doing glazing. One is that most of the glazes are pretty harmless. If it says that it's not food safe on it, that's one that you're not going to want to be putting your hands into. But most of them, they've gotten more or less all the materials out of Claymakers that are going to be really, really harmful or toxic to you at this point. That being said, just like wet clay, a wet glaze is going to dry your skin out, takes the oils out of your hands. So you're not going to want to be dipping your hands into it more than you really need to. Able to not dip a piece in and get the glaze on the bottom, that's great. So this one was really easy to glaze. I can put it right in. I'm not going to immerse the bottom, and it's going to stay clean. But if I'm not able to keep part of the clay that I want glaze-free clean just by putting the glaze on it, then I'm going to want to coat it with a liquid water-based wax and let that dry before I do my glazing. So rather than just keeping this out of the glaze, I can take and coat it with a little bit of wax. And this also dries through absorption, so it dries very quickly. I'd say 2-3 minutes. I always try and get my embossed name, and there we go. Throw that brush into water immediately if you're not going to use it right away for another one, so it doesn't dry on there. And then I'm just going to let this dry. Little pro tip for you. What I like to do when I'm kind of planning my glazing is I take all my pieces and I lay them out upside down. I look at my glazes, I get out my test tiles, I think through my glazing, and I take a pencil and I write exactly what I'm going to do on the bottom of every piece. After I've written it on the pot, I can cold wax it. That protects it while I'm working so it doesn't get rubbed off. I can take a picture of all the bottoms with my cell phone. I have a record now of what I did on every single pot. And that pencil is just going to burn off in the firing. So you don't have to worry about that being on here permanently. All right, I'm already touching this like crazy. It's already dry. So this one's ready to be put in the glaze already. Really, really quick. So that's a nice way of kind of keeping things nice and clean. That is it at this point. Oh, one last thing. The freshly glazed piece would go over onto our cone 6 glaze shelf. There are there's 3 major groups of glaze that we have in the studio. One of them is raku, which is a different firing technique, and you should know if you're in a raku class, and your teacher should tell you you're using raku glazes. The other is cone 6 oxidation. Oxidation means the electric kilns. An oxidation firing is a firing in which nothing is combusted. So you don't burn gas or coal or wood. There's no carbon in the atmosphere. And then we have reduction. When you're looking at the test tiles, make sure you're looking at the wall for the thing you're going to actually be doing. Don't look at the reduction test tiles if you're putting it into the electric kilns. And our general cone 6 shelves are always the electric kilns. If you're going to fire something in the gas kiln or the reduction kiln, that goes over in a separate shelf, and you can just ask somebody where that is when that time comes. Sometimes it moves around a little bit. All right, so most of the glazes are stored here in 5-gallon or 2-gallon buckets. And before you use them, you're going to want to make sure that you're stirring them up really well. One of the issues with a water-based glaze is that a glaze is made out of more than one material. 4 or 5 different materials, and they're all different sizes of particles, and they all settle at different rates. So if I go to use the glaze and it hasn't been stirred up in a while, I might have flux at the top, colorant at the bottom, ball clay or the clay is more in the middle. And when I dunk my piece in, it's not going to come out consistent, and the glaze color won't look the way that I want it to actually look. Let's go ahead and take a close look at these buckets here. Just to start off with, if you open up the bucket and there's a whole bunch of glaze on the lid, before you use it, you want to scrape that glaze into the bucket. The more that people leave the buckets like this, the less the glaze is going to be what you're expecting when it comes out of the kiln. Like I said, if these materials are settling at different rates, and if people leave glaze stuck on the sides of the buckets, then eventually this glaze isn't going to be the glaze that you think it is on the test tiles. So I'm going to want to clean this lid off, and most of these should have a brush in the bucket. I'm also going to want to maybe scrub some of this off before I even get started. And I recommend that you not use the lids as a coaster. That's why they're getting so much glaze on them. When you're done with your brush, you should put your brush somewhere where you're going to wipe it up after you're done with it. So I'm going to scrape this bucket. I'm going to get this toilet brush right down into the corners. I'm going to make sure I'm scrubbing the edges really, really well. I'm going to get it all really well stirred up. When I'm done, I can knock the glaze off of my brush. There's actually some chunks still on here, so I'm going to try and get those chunks mixed in. You don't want a bunch of chunks in your glaze. Those will be thick spots. All right, so I'm not going to put this on the lid. I'm actually going to put it on the table. That way it's a surface that I know I'm going to wipe up and clean after I'm all done. All right, so this is how I'm going to start off. If I were to talk to you for 5 minutes and not dip my piece into the glaze, I would want to actually remix this. Some of these settle very quickly. So I would want to, if I've been talking, come back, mix this up. Another thing to keep in mind while you're glazing, I only have one glaze bucket open at a time. You don't want to have this glaze bucket open and another glaze bucket open where I'm kind of reaching over an open bucket to do my glazing. Some of these, if I get a drip of cobalt glaze in the clear glaze, we basically have light blue glaze. So some of these colorants are really potent. You don't want to be glazing in a messy way and getting one mixed into the other one. So I'm just working with this one here. And the piece that I'm going to be glazing, it's actually really, really nice for not having to worry too much about keeping the bottom of it clean. Here at Claymakers, we want you to keep 1/4 inch of the bottom of your pot glaze free. And there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. With this piece, I have kind of a nice obvious 1/4 inch foot on it. And with this one, I have an obvious foot, but I put a 1/4 inch bevel on the bottom. And so that would count as my glaze free area. Having some kind of a foot makes it so it's a lot easier to actually manipulate the piece and to dip it into the glaze. And you want to think about, how am I going to get the glaze into the bucket? How am I getting it out of the bucket? How am I doing it in a way that I won't drop it? For the most part, I don't use dipping tongs. Let me grab a pair of dipping tongs. Let's see. This will be where we edit. Go ahead and keep videoing. No point in being able to cut if you don't cut some stuff out. All right, dipping tongs. It'll look like I stepped away for 1 second. All right, so these are dipping tongs. And one of the problems with the dipping tongs is that they have a tendency to kind of slide from side to side. And when you're holding a piece, if it slips like that, often people will drop them. They're useful when you can use them. And you also want to be careful if your piece has really thin walls. You have to put a little bit of pressure on this as you're putting it into the glaze. And as the pot fills up with glaze, it gets heavy. And if you bear down on the tongs, the metal points can break through the side of the pot. So these are great when they're appropriate. For smaller pieces like this, I almost never use them. Another thing to keep in mind when you're planning on how you're going to glaze is that our biggest problem here is the glaze being too thick on the outside. So to help minimize that, you're always going to want to do your inside color first. Even if I'm glazing this piece all the same top to bottom, in and out, I'm going to still want to put a glaze on the inside of the pot first. To do that, I'm going to use a plastic container here, and I'm just going to fill it all the way up, right to the top. I can hang it on the bucket and then just pour it, the excess, back into the bucket. I can turn it as I go, do a nice even coat. You are going to want to shake this. Don't shake it. It's like this primitive instinct. I want to shake it so there's no drips, right? You shake it and you shake the drips out. That's not how it works. This is drying from absorption. If I shake it, it shakes the drips in instead of getting rid of them. And that's not what I want. So another great advantage of glazing the inside first is that if I get extra glaze on the outside of the piece, I can just wipe it off before I dip the outside. If I did the outside first, and then I got glaze on it drip from the inside, it's going to be really messy and it's going to be really hard to clean up. All right, always have a nice cleanup bucket next to you so you can kind of keep things clean as you're going. So now the inside of this is done, and I can glaze the outside of it. I'll get my little bucket out of the way here. I'm holding onto the foot, and as I put it into the bucket, I'm keeping it straight up and down so that the air will get trapped inside of it. And then I won't get extra glaze going into the inside of the piece. All right, here's those chunks I mentioned that I didn't get mixed out of it. If I need to get rid of them, do it now before this dries. Chunks are bad. Sometimes those chunks are actually little bits of bisque. I'm just going to re-dip that edge real quick. Never leave a chunk on the outside if you don't know whether or not it's glaze or a little shard of something. 9 times out of 10, if you leave that little lump there, it's going to come out of the glaze firing and it's going to turn out to have been a piece of garbage or something, and it's just going to be baked onto the edge of your mug. All right, drips, little problems, even these inconsistent parts on the rim, all that's going to melt, flux out during the firing. But I am going to want to make sure that I have no glaze in the bottom. So I'm going to take and put this on a flat sponge and just twist it. And doing that is not only going to clean off the very bottom, but it's going to kind of feather the glaze up the side slightly. So it's nice and clean for my 1/4 inch. All right, now I want to show what I was talking about for a scratch test. So if we take a close look at this, you're going to want to come in close and not just rely on the zoom. Okay, so just the cup is in it. All right, so I'm going to start fresh so that we'll cut all of this little chatting bit out. All right, so if you take a close look at this, I'm going to take either a pin tool or a knife, and I'm going to just find a spot on my piece and just scratch into it. So what I'm looking for is a scratch where there's like grains of sand on either side, and those grains of sand are indicating with that scratch that this is a perfect thickness. If I did a scratch and instead of grains of sand, I saw nothing, then that glaze is too thin. If instead of grains of sand, I get chunks breaking off, then that glaze is too thick. So a scratch test is always going to be your most accurate way of telling whether or not you've got the correct glaze thickness on a piece. And you don't have to just rely on how long did you dip it for, how big is it, or anything like that. And some of the glazes are a little bit gelatinous, where when you first mix them, you think this glaze is really, really thick. But once you put it on and do a scratch test, the glaze looks right. All right, you can go ahead and go back, and I'm going to grab a test tile so I can talk about that. So in order to see what some of the things you can expect from the glaze are, you're going to use the test tiles that we've got on the wall in the glazing room. And these test tiles are kind of designed to give you different pieces of information. First off, there are 2 dips in order to cover this test tile with glaze. The first dip goes all the way to the bottom here, and then the second dip goes about halfway. So you can see thick would be the top, thin would be the bottom, what colors to expect from the glaze. And a lot of them change quite a bit from thick to thin. This one is fairly consistent. Another thing that you're going to get from these test tiles is that they're hexagonal. And because of that, they've got a sharp edge that the glaze can break over. So when a glaze goes thinner and changes color over a bit of detail or a raised piece like this, that's called breaking. So I can see that this glaze looks nice when it breaks. I can also see there's a texture on this side of the tile, so I can see what it does on the texture. There's a white slip line. I can see what it does over that. And I can see what it does over a black slip line. So there's lots of good information on here for the glaze that I've put onto this pot. So ahead of time, I can see if it's at all difficult or might do anything strange. If I can see that the glaze is running right off of the test tile, that's when I'm going to want to be careful of. And most of the glazes that are a little bit runny actually say that on the bucket. It says runny glaze, or it'll say inside only, or something like that. We try not to be really subtle about which glazes are going to be runny and which aren't. And when I'm all done with this glaze, I'm going to want to wipe off the lid. And if it's fairly clean on the inside, I'd wipe the inside real quick. If I've gotten any on the outside of the bucket or anywhere around the bucket, I want to get that all washed up. So unfortunately, with glazing, this is a game of hot potato. If you're the one who's touching the glaze bucket, you're the one responsible for how the glaze bucket looks. So unfortunately, I'm the guy who, there's all this mess here around this glaze. Well, I'm the last one to use it, so I have to clean all this up. And hopefully, this will encourage you when you're in the studio and you see somebody leaving a mess. Either you can tell them yourself, or you can tell one of the studio assistants or an instructor that they're leaving a mess behind, and we will tell them that they need to come and clean it up. If we don't have them clean it up, then the next guy who comes is the one who's going to get stuck with it. And if I come over and I see you using a glaze and putting it back and it's messy, I'm going to make you clean it up. So sorry, but every time I'm in here, I clean the buckets and I clean the carts, and I haven't been doing any glazing. So it might feel a little unfair, but it's going to be universally unfair. So at least it's consistently unfair. Take it where you get it. So I'm actually cleaning the sides of this bucket up because I'm the last one to use this bucket. If we all do this, we'll be in much better shape. All right. On the floor here, you can see I left some drips. I need to wipe those up. No leaving drips. The number one health hazard in ceramics is dust. And the number one place that dust comes from is from us dripping wet clay or glaze on the floor, not mopping it up. It dries out. We scuff our feet as we walk across the floor. It goes airborne. Clay dust stays in the air for a minimum of 18 hours, and that's in a still room. If nobody comes in the room, if nobody does anything, and if there's no airflow, that dust is in the air for 18 hours. I guarantee you there is not an 18-hour chunk of time in which this studio is empty. So that dust stays in the air forever until we inhale it and it sticks in our lungs. So to keep everybody safe and healthy, drips on the floor have to get cleaned up, buckets need to be cleaned off, surfaces like my table here, this gets cleaned up when I'm done. We don't leave messes behind. All right, my stir stick, all of that goes in my cleaning bucket here. My little container, all of this stuff cleaned up when you're all finished. All right,